So I'm going to ask you a question. What is General Electric and Caterpillar and Motorola and McDonald's and Marriott and Google and a host of other companies all have in common? They've all moved their headquarters from suburban locations in the last 3 years into cities. Probably the most dramatic one is General Electric, who moved from a 72-acre campus in suburban Connecticut into downtown into downtown Boston. They moved from a campus with thousands of surface parking spaces to a office building in downtown Boston with no parking. McDonald's moved from a suburban campus in a very nice suburban community outside of Chicago into downtown Chicago. Why did they do that? You need to know this. They're chasing talent. McDonald's, where their campus was, beautiful campus in a community that did not have any rental property and no downtown. It took 2 subway rides and a taxi from the end of the subway to get to their campus. I have a 28-year-old son who doesn't even have a driver's license. And some of you could probably, General Motors survey recently just said that a 24-year-old is 6 times less likely to own an automobile than their parents did at that age. We are watching a fundamental transformation of how people want to live. And the choices they're beginning to make about how they live. That's not everybody, but it is increasingly a large number of young people, particularly, and people with gray hair like me, who are making choices about how they want to live. And it has huge opportunities for cities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about a new opportunity that has been created. I hate to keep using the word opportunity, that has been created with the recently passed tax laws, and it created an opportunity zone that permits people to invest capital gains into designated areas. And somebody was really smart here in Allentown is that they defined the opportunity zone area as your downtown in the surrounding neighborhood. So it provides another vehicle on top of the neighborhood and improvement zone and new market tax credits and historic tax credits. It provides another asset opportunity for capital to invest in this zone. And so we're going to talk about that today. And so we're going to have 3 tiers of speakers. We're going to have 2 speakers first, Evan Weiss and Charlie Dent, and then we're going to go to a second tier of speakers, and then we're going to have a panel talking about the opportunities in Allentown. You can see out in the lobby there's a map that shows the zone and the NIZ, but it also shows a dozen opportunities to invest today, property that are in friendly hands that you can invest in today and take advantage of the opportunity zone. With that, let me ask Evan Weiss to come up. Evan is with PEL Analytics. He works with cities all over the eastern seaboard, maybe out west also, and looking at their markets and opportunities, and he's been looking at the opportunity zones and what it represents for Allentown. Evan?
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear okay? I heard the mic was cutting out a little bit. Okay. I was told to try to talk about Chapter 3 of the Opportunity Zone program, assume that there's a good deal of knowledge in the room about some of the fundamentals. But I did want to just touch a little bit on how the program came about, because I think there's some significant importance in that in terms of how we're seeing the program evolve. So I worked for then Mayor, now Senator Cory Booker, who was one of the architects of the program, and it is cutting out. Okay, I'll use that. So in Newark, similar story to Pittsburgh, almost actually the same size city as Pittsburgh was and now is. Now it's a little smaller than Pittsburgh, but just lost an extraordinary amount of investment over the years. And a lot of it was because of changes in the tax law. and different things that encourage developers to move elsewhere, to make investment elsewhere, whether that was how mortgages are treated, whether that's how you subsidize the building of a highway, whether that's how you might depreciate a shopping mall, other kind of suburban infrastructure. Just took a lot of money out. So what we were trying to do there, and thinking about kind of the genesis of this program, was to redirect capital. And really, at that time, while there was a real estate focus, a lot of the intent was on business and to try to get venture business investment into the cities that had lost it. And so at this point, just a show of hands, how many people here are mostly in the development real estate side of things? So this is fairly typical. There's a bit more of a focus on that for a number of reasons, and so we'll kind of get to that eventually. But the most useful statistic with this is just that about 80% of all investment was just going into 3 markets. It's going to New York, California, and kind of the greater Boston area with respect to new venture firms. We wanted to try to change the underlying structure of the economy and redirect a lot of that investment back to the communities that had seen it, for most of American history, much more distribution of how investment was made, and particularly into cities. There are a lot of programs that existed then, exist now, that aren't as structural. They don't really change how people think about investing. People develop niches in it, in new markets tax credits, historic tax credits, the NIS program, or other things that are sort of place-based. But it kind of just leaves everything, you can do things with it, but it's still the same fundamental economy we're working with. The point of the program was just to change that. And so how it's actually changing in practice, I think what we're seeing so far is different than what was expected, again, with this focus on real estate. And also just the sheer number of zones that we have in America is more than I think we initially planned to have. So where we go from this point, I think, is just to talk a little bit about the kinds of investment that's happening now. As all of you know, for the most part, is that we don't have full regulations yet. Regulations are likely to come out sometime just before or just after the election. Regulations were filed with the Office of Management and Budget for their review and comment, but we don't know exactly what's in them. The kind of sense we hear from Washington is that these regulations will be focused on some of the initial questions relative to deployment. How quickly do you actually have to deploy your funds in the opportunity zone? There's different kind of triggers that the law has. That's been keeping a lot of investors kind of away from the program initially because they're not sure realistically if they can get a project done within the 6-month or 30-month period. So I think what is important to note is just even if we do get regulations on that specific topic, we're not going to really have that much information or as much information as we might like even then. But that's not stopping a lot of investment. So the kind of investment that's going on, and I feel just from my personal experience and seeing different opportunity zones around the country, there's already been billions of dollars worth of investment in projects, but that money is very specific. And it's very specific in terms of how it actually chooses to invest in a market. The money primarily comes from a single investor, someone who sold a business, and someone that's looking for a particular project. So when we talk about funds, opportunity funds, the idea initially was to try to create something that's sort of an open pool of investment that then invests into different projects. That's difficult for a number of reasons, and the law wasn't really designed in actuality to be a fund. It really serves as a way just to incorporate or design an entity and to make sure that entity itself, whether it's a business or a piece of real estate, can actually be the beneficiary of that investment. So one of the first things we encourage people to think about is just what individual projects, what individual businesses may qualify, and then to identify a specific investor or specific pool of capital to invest in that project. I think that's just very important, particularly now, before we kind of see a lot of big institutional investment or kind of ever the structure of funds that might look more familiar to people who invest more globally. it's really thinking about what's out there and to tie a specific investor to a specific project. So where these investments are actually happening, I think, depends a great deal on what the actual opportunity zones are like. There are 8,700 of these opportunity zones. I believe there are 300 in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh both have a significant amount of them in the state. Across the border in New Jersey, there's 169. New York State has around 400 opportunity zones. So the fact is that if these opportunity zones, if there were 100 of them, like some of the previous empowerment zones, previous federal incentives, that would have been enough. It would have been enough to have this special tax break to really drive investment into a given community. But because there are so many, once we get past kind of if you know the person with the capital or the institution with the capital on the project, to really make an opportunity zone competitive requires some really specific things to be true. Because in this state, as in every state, there are frankly opportunity zones of that 300 that this will not affect. That if they just kind of are left to their own devices, it's not going to generate any new investment because there's simply always going to be a better place to invest than some of the most distressed opportunity zones that are out there. So my group, on Monday, there's a group called Accelerator for America that my group, Pell Analytics, is working with, which is started by Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles, but then a few other mayors, one from South Bend, Indiana, one from Oklahoma City, one from Louisville. And our charge there was to try to develop kind of a framework or investor prospectus for different cities with different opportunity zones, and then to try to figure out like basically 10 different steps or 10 qualities of those zones that make them really investable. Because again, there are some zones that are going to have the market fundamentals today, like those three markets I referenced earlier, California, New York, and Boston. They have opportunity zones. San Francisco, Oakland, New York City, they all have opportunity zones too. Most of those neighborhoods will do fine. Harlem is going to get investment from opportunity zones without basically lifting a finger. So as we kind of move from those 8,700 down the list, in those communities, what are the qualities that they need to have to see investment? If, again, we kind of maybe move past the first series of projects that we know the capital is, we know what the projects are, but what are the overall qualities? I think the first is just really demonstrating an already existing power, underlying market power in the real estate market and general improvements that a lot of cities just still don't have, and I think are hoping to see the opportunity zone sort of facilitate, bring people together to try to make that happen. But they haven't seen the changes in the underlying economy. They haven't seen the changes in kind of the underlying structure of governance to really make these things possible. I think one of the most important qualities is just seeing that there is a bought-in community, one that has the institutional resources to actually get these kinds of projects done, and also has, when I keep saying institutions, that means cities, that means the cities themselves, as in the city of Allentown, corporate governance, different kind of, corporate stakeholders, different kinds of institutions like universities, colleges, hospitals. These institutions, I think, in some of the most successful places we've seen, a great one is South Bend and Notre Dame, where Notre Dame doesn't necessarily get any benefits, tax benefits, by investing in the opportunity zone, but they would get a substantial amount of benefits simply by trying to use their own funds, their own commercialization infrastructure, their own research to really develop and try to attract other investors who do get the tax benefits to them. In this state, there are some major corporations in the Northwest and the Pittsburgh area and Philly that are all trying to take advantage of the opportunity zones for themselves and reinvest in their own community, build out some of that institutional infrastructure, because remember, corporations can also take advantage of this opportunity zone program just like individuals can. So the government has a role to play, local institutions have a role to play, and I think in particular it's very important for the hospitals and the universities to consider, particularly as many of them make forays into more tech transfer or research, to see how they can fit into this and drive investment where they like. Another really crucial part is foundations, philanthropy, nonprofit. I mentioned earlier at the beginning just we expected to see a lot of business investment, and I think there's a reason we haven't seen as much, which in part is just due to the regulations, which make it harder right now to understand how you might actually invest in business. But what a lot of the philanthropies and foundations are looking to do on a national and local perspective is to try to incentivize business investment by putting up loan guarantees, subordinated debt, or grants to try to drive those investments into the opportunity zone infrastructure. So I know I've already said it, and I'll end with this, is just what really sets communities apart is just functioning like a community, is being open to investors and looking like everyone kind of understands and is bought in as to the idea of what this could mean. Because if an outside investor or someone who might be local but has been sitting on the sideline sees a fractured community, sees one that doesn't have sort of institutions all rowing in the same boat trying to make change, it can be difficult really to create investment opportunities without that being known there. This law has very particular deadlines. If projects can't move relatively quickly, if they can't get permitted relatively quickly, then they'll have trouble meeting the statutory definitions of the law. And so making sure all that is sort of in order is just absolutely critical.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. Thank you. Now we're going to ask Charlie Dent to come up. Charlie and I served in the legislature many years ago when Republicans and Democrats could actually talk to each other and work together. And he tried to carry that ethic into Congress. And I think became very frustrated. A 7-term congressman with DLA Piper now, and the CNN contributor, was in Congress when this legislation was passed. So he has unique insights. Charlie.
Thank you, Tom. And and Tom reminded me too. I should say Mayor Murphy. He reminded me that when he first met me, I had no gray hair, and I said to him, I've only ever known him with gray hair. Just a few things. Appreciate the City Center has put this program on, and thank you all for attending. Thank you, Evan, and I'll give a shout out to his boss in a moment, who was very much involved with the establishment of these federal opportunity zones. But let me just say a couple of things that I just want to get off my chest here about the program. The tax reform legislation that passed. I guess late last year, was obviously very controversial. And most of the focus on that tax reform legislation the public focus anyway, dealt with things like the state and local tax deductions, very controversial. Also, changes to the corporate tax code that were, in my view, were very necessary. There are all sorts of things that were done in that bill that we can argue about. Some very good, some of you say, well, it was bad. I supported the legislation, but the bottom line is one of the provisions that was tucked away in this bill, and candidly was not really much of a focus of the debate, of the public debate. I would argue that probably most members of Congress, probably weren't very familiar with this provision when it was being discussed. It was probably more of an afterthought for most of them, this opportunity zone provision. But it was really based on some legislation that had been introduced by 4 members, 2 in the Senate. Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, of course, Cory Booker of New Jersey. He was the lead Democrat on the provision. And on the House side, it was Ohio Congressman Pat Tiberi, who's also, like me, just recently left Congress. He was of the Ways and Means Committee. And Ron Kind, one of the leaders of the New Democrat Coalition from Wisconsin, also on the Ways and Means Committee. And so they're the ones who really were the authors behind this provision. And the fact that this provision is very bipartisan actually helps. And let me just tell you why. Because if it'll protect, this provision will likely be protected in the event there's a change in Congress. Say the House flips, goes from Republican to Democrat. I don't think this is the kind of thing that'll ever come under attack. So even though there might be concerns about the broader tax law and the state and local tax deductions, this provision is likely going to survive for a very long time. So you're a bit inoculated. And that's really good, given the fact that there could be a shift of control in Congress. I should also let you know, too, this opportunity zone idea, I guess you could say had its origins, goes back to the Jack Kemp days, really, with his urban revitalization programs. You remember the enterprise zones. That's kind of where it all began. But those enterprise zones tended to be a bit complex, and a lot of folks weren't able to take advantage of them for a variety of reasons. So along comes the opportunity zones. But the purpose, of course, is to unlock private investment, to stimulate, the local economy, support entrepreneurs, obviously redevelop these blighted and distressed properties, and also certainly help encourage investment in local infrastructure projects. And so basically that's the purpose behind this whole provision. Right now, I was hoping I was going to be able to announce to you today that the regulations would have been promulgated or made public. They have not. We were expecting them probably 3 weeks ago, right? July. But, well, I was told, I've been checking since JB spoke to me about this event each week. I was told next week, every week. I was told that they were coming out next week. And truthfully, most of the regulations out of this tax law have been coming out fairly quickly. This one is taking longer, although they keep promising me it's going to be next week. So I wanted you to be aware that this is happening. One interesting aspect of these opportunity zones from the Lehigh Valley's perspective is obviously we're sitting right here in the neighborhood improvement zone, the NIZ. Many of the leaders of that NIZ are here. Obviously, Bethlehem, too, also has a CRIZ. And the fact that you'll be able to layer this opportunity zone over top of the NIZ or the CRIZ will likely give really interesting benefits to our area. Maybe unique. Certainly the NIZ, and I just little shout out from my law firm, DLA Piper. We're the biggest law firm in the world, 90 offices, 40 countries, but we're probably best known for our real estate practice, which is really substantial. And I had one of our partners come up last week, two of our partners, Evan Migdale and Melissa Girock came up, my colleagues, and they were not particularly familiar with the NIZ, prior to this, and they became educated. They became educated very quickly on the NIZ and the CRIZ, and are of the belief that what we have here in Allentown is perhaps singular, unique anywhere in the country in terms of the opportunity. And so the question is, how do you make sure people who are investing are aware of the potential opportunities here, because they haven't seen anything like it, and they've seen a lot of tax stuff. In fact, our firm is actually doing. We're helping various communities around the country develop these opportunity zone funds. We're working very closely with the island of Puerto Rico, which is unlike any other state in terms of the 95% of the island was designated as an opportunity zone, and it's different there, and they have all kinds of problems. With fiscal problems, financial problems, the hurricane, of course, and the continuing recovery efforts. So they're in a different spot. But here we have people with in this community, we have people who have a lot of knowledge. They have projects. They're organized. They really know what they're doing. So that's an advantage. So our firm is also certainly working with the state of New Jersey very closely, many communities in New Jersey, as well as areas of Washington, D.C. So that's just something that we've taken a great interest in. But beyond that, we think that this program will drive more investment just for a couple of reasons. One, I should say not we. I'm going back to Congress now. Congress thinks this is simpler than the enterprise zones of yesteryear. So these opportunity zones, of course, they think it's simpler because you're going to be able to use original or unrealized capital gains in many respects, and you can put them in these opportunity zone funds. And as far as I can tell, and the regs will tell us more when they are revealed, that you need to create the fund, and then the opportunity zone fund, and then of course get the money in and then move the money out. They want to see the money move. So we'll have more to say about that when the regs are out. But beyond that, I won't add too much, except to say it's great to be here with so many friends who've been investing and part of this community for a very long time. And by the way, another little commercial for me. Next Tuesday night, if you're in Philadelphia, stop by the Pyramid Club, 6 to 8. They're welcoming me to DLA Piper down there, so come on down. See me after class if you want to attend. And with that, I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thanks, Charlie. I want to commend the speakers on staying on time. I didn't have to bring the hook. I'm going to ask two quick questions and then open up for some quick questions from the audience. Evan, maybe you need to do Opportunity Zone 101, sort of what it is, because I'm assuming a lot of people know 101 Opportunity Zone, but there are going to be some that don't, and maybe just 1 minute of what it means.
Sure. So, is this back working again, or no? Here we go. Okay. Here we go. So, just want to focus on something the congressman said, which is just that this is meant to be simple. And I know it doesn't sound simple, but compared to some of these other laws, kind of once you get the hang of it, the principles are not that difficult. There's very, very, very few restrictions on the kinds of investments you can make. You can't open a hot tub parlor. I'm sorry. But beyond that, there's really not that much. I mean, there's sin businesses, that's it. There's some property rules that you have to follow. But really what it is if you have a capital gain of any kind, you sell a piece of property, you sell a business, you sell a stock, anything. If you take the proceeds of that, you need to invest it in something called a qualified opportunity fund. The qualified opportunity fund, as I said, can really just be something that holds a single project. It can be a house you want to buy, or it can just be something that holds stock or some other kind of interest in a company. So if you sell your property for $10, you get a $10 capital gain. You put that in the opportunity fund. There's 3 benefits. The first benefit is that as soon as you put your money into the fund, all the capital gain tax you would have owed on that sale is deferred. And it's deferred until either you sell your stake in the opportunity fund or December 31st of 2026. That's the first benefit. The second benefit is if you hold that investment for 5 years, you get a 10% reduction in the capital gain tax you'll eventually have to pay, the capital gains tax that comes due in 2026. If you hold it for 7 years, you get an additional 5% reduction in that capital gains tax. So that's now a total of 15% reduction when the tax comes due. The third incentive applies to your new investment. So you put that $10 investment in the opportunity fund, you bought a house with it, now that house is worth $20. Any of the capital gain, the gain that you've made on that new investment, if you hold it for at least 10 years, and the at least is a question in terms of how long you can hold it after 10 years, but if you hit the 10-year mark, then all of that capital gain, the $10 to $20 capital gain, is entirely tax-free from a federal perspective. So that is the heart of the incentive. That's what's driving the most of this. Majority of the investment interest is on that aspect of things. And so why finding a community with the right balance of kind of a low basis, buying low and selling high, is where a lot of people are really looking. Obviously, you can buy low in a lot of places and never sell high. And so the places that are doing the best are the ones that have that kind of potential.
And Charlie, do you have a sense, both from your really congressional hat and your DLA Piper hat, do you have a sense of a fund being created in the Allentown area?
Well, I don't want to speak for anyone in particular, but I suspect there are a few people in this room who are considering creating a fund. And I think that's where, candidly, some folks are going to need some help creating that fund, interpreting the regulations that will soon be coming out. That's kind of what we do. And we're going to be spending a hell of a lot of time clarifying this for people. But we do think that these funds will be sought after. As I said, we're already working with a lot of folks in New Jersey, Puerto Rico, where it's challenging, and of course Washington D.C. But we think that that there are going to be a lot of funds. I think there are going to be funds created. I can't. You might want to ask somebody. Some in the audience might be better able to answer whether they're creating the funds, but I think there will be some significant funds created around here.
And do you have a sense, both of you, that is there going to be some really large, sort of big brokerage companies creating large funds that will be looking around, and then hundreds of maybe thousands of smaller ones?
I think it's going along a continuum where today there are opportunity funds. I want to be totally clear on that. Like, try, if you can, you have kind of a basic framework, go to legal counsel, accountants, and try to figure out if your deal might work, because these kind of simpler 1 or 2 project funds are just happening today. The larger funds are going to take time, and mostly that's because, one, it's just hard to be a large fund given all the timing rules in terms of how this work. But then, two, it's harder to get banks or large institutional investors to move on this because we don't know the entirety of the regs, the compliance, how this fits with all the various SEC rules. It's harder for them to move. That being said, there are some major banks, including ones based in your former, where you're mayor, that are trying to get into this very heavily. Yes. So there's a lot of groups that are definitely looking into this or partnering. If they're not putting their own capital at risk, they might want to lend into it. But most of the big Wall Street firms, some of the big venture firms are definitely moving quickly on this, are very interested, but only a few so far have really started to put their own money to work.
Okay, let's open quickly for a few questions. Any questions? Back, all the way in the back. Jack, run.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest questions that we've had, and as you put it, it sounds as though the opportunity funds only come into effect when you actually have a gain. So new money cannot invest into these funds. So do you see that as being an impediment to the actual investment taking place?
So it is tougher. I mean, not everyone can just kind of realize a gain or make it appear, but this really was, I mean, you probably know that one of the brainchilds of this was Sean Parker, who was the early Facebook investor, and he was just kind of looking at himself and his buddies, and they're the richest people in the world, but they all have gains on paper. They have stock. They don't really have the money. So this was directed at a class of people who could sell and incur a capital gain relatively easily. And I think that's why we are seeing a lot of real estate deals or people selling businesses being the basis of their investment. To be clear, you can invest in an opportunity fund without incurring a capital gain. You just don't get the same tax benefits. So if you have a partner who has the gain or you don't, that's still a very viable thing to do. But this was done for the very particular reason of getting that, supposedly the current accounting is about $6 trillion of just unrealized capital gain, encouraging people to actually realize it and keeping their money offshore or wherever it might be and putting it to work in the economy.
Other Charlie, go ahead.
I'm hoping it wouldn't be a disinvestment to investment that we've only allowed for the use of these unrealized capital gains. But I keep coming back to the fact that this community has something unique to offer. In addition to the NIS and the CRIS, and of course you're going to layer this over top of it, you know, the issue is how do you communicate this to people on the outside, potential investors who are not from this area, who may want to invest here. That's the real trick, I think, for us. And one advantage we have here, and I'm going to praise some, like JB and others in this room, they have projects. And the people here know what they're doing. In many respects, they're good, and I think a lot of investors would be very interested to know that we have people here who can get buildings up fairly quickly can fill them, but they may not live in this community. But we need to communicate this to those folks who are making these real estate investments, outside of this region, and try to draw that in. They do have those unrealized capital gains. I think there's plenty of money out there. It's just a matter of making sure that they're aware of the opportunities that are here.
One last question. Over here.
Okay, a question we have for you. Most discussions regarding opportunity zones seem to be centered around real estate investments. Do you think the legislation will stimulate investing in business? If so, why?
Again, I think that was a lot of the intention of the legislation, was to allow for that. And again, to go back to some of the venture folks who were involved in the formulation of it, was that some of them have said they're going to now require, if they're starting a new venture firm or making an investment or not making a new venture investment, that business be in an opportunity zone. The catch is that it's kind of hard to know what businesses qualify and what don't, based on some of the rules, which primarily relate to where the business does its business. So one easy example, I was talking to someone yesterday who's interested in forming an opportunity fund that invests in laundromats. And basically a laundromat is a business, its property is in one place, it conducts its service in an opportunity zone, has a pretty good return on investment. but we know exactly where it's doing its business, where its property is, and so forth. It gets harder if you're a manufacturing firm. You have a lot of inventory moving all over the place. You probably have trucks that are delivering products at a given time. A lot of your assets might be outside of the opportunity zone at any given moment. The intention was to try to prevent people from basically skirting the law, and by saying they, basically open up a P.O. box in an opportunity zone and doing their business elsewhere. That was what we were trying to avoid. But in practice, what's happened is it's created a lot of uncertainty about where businesses can actually operate. I think the regulations, and this is probably, there's two issues that have received the most kind of push from a lot of the folks who are asking for changes in the regulations. This was one of them, to really further clarify how businesses, what kind of businesses can do this, and to not punish businesses that are clearly based in an opportunity zone generating their money there, but maybe have property elsewhere or opened up at the wrong time. And I think one of the cool things we're seeing is real estate investment that builds accelerators or incubators in opportunity zones, and then tries to work with them, provide technical assistance to set up a series of opportunity zone businesses within that piece of real estate, which helps the real estate investment. And that, I think, we're seeing, again, some really interesting higher education partnerships. Providence, Rhode Island, and Brown University, good example of that, and Wexford, which is a major operator in that space. There's a lot of stuff to be done there, but right now it's complicated, so this is one of the, pray for regulations, and if you don't get them, then look at the kinds of businesses with an attorney, again, that might be able to help you define what businesses are safe.
I think Evan's answer was very complete on that question. That pretty much sums it up. Just one other thing, too. I neglected to mention my colleague in the room here, Drew Kent. He was my chief of staff in Washington. Raise your hand, Drew. Stand in the back there. And he's joined me over at DLA. But if you have questions about how to set up these funds or the regulations, please call us. We're going to be spending a lot of time with a lot of folks trying to help them sort this out. Even though the intent of these zones is to be more simplified in terms of utilizing these unrealized capital gains, I can guarantee you the regulations are not going to be so simple. They are going to be fairly complex, and it's going to take some doing to understand them.
Thank you. Let's give Evan and Charlie a good hand for. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
They're going to be back up, and when we have the full panel discussion, we now have the second group of two speakers. J.B. Riley is president and co-founder of City Center Investment, $450 million of investment to date in downtown Allentown, and another $200 million coming out of the ground. I was impressed with the cranes. And Ralph Don Bernard is an executive director of the Downtown Allentown Community Development Initiative, which is an initiative of corporate and philanthropic executives who aim to revitalize Center City. Allentown must be good partnerships. JB, why don't you start?
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. Great to see everybody here in downtown Allentown. We became aware of this legislation probably for the first time back in February or March, and have really paid very, very close attention to it. And I first met Evan, I think, in May, and he was in town, trying to evaluate this marketplace and kind of link it to the opportunities under the legislation. And so over the last 6 years, our company has really spent a lot of time thinking about this, researching and meeting with Charlie's partners, going to symposiums. In fact, I was on a panel yesterday in New York talking about opportunity zones. And when you really kind of boil it down, at least from our perspective, there's 8,700 districts, opportunity zones, census tracts that have been designated across the country, and every zone isn't the same. And when you really start thinking about what are the attributes of opportunity zones that are most attractive, it really comes down to risk. Where is an investor going to invest their money where they're going to be able to, mitigate risk and make a return? And so, when you start thinking objectively through objective criteria about what those attributes are, I think you kind of logically conclude that we have a pretty good thing going here in Allentown. So let me just talk a little bit about why I think The Opportunity Zone here in Allentown is superior to and will attract investment. First of all, we have our locally and our state incentives are aligned with the zone. So, whether it's the NIS here in Allentown or the CRIZ in Bethlehem, the Opportunity Zone overlays that very robust state legislation. We also have KOZ zones. We also have other governmental programs at the city level, through AEDC and others that are centered around the areas within the zone. So we think that's really important. We have a very a good local government environment. Permitting, zoning approvals. We have a very cooperative arrangement. You'll hear from Leonard Leitner a little bit later about how the city approaches development. But that's really important because the way the legislation is written, you've got to move quickly. You've got to be able to deploy your capital within a fairly short period of time. And so if you go into a marketplace that doesn't have their act together, has a lot of red tape, a lot of time to getting a shovel in the ground, even if the investment looks good, you might be frozen out because of the timing. So being having that local cooperation from government is really important. And we also, not only do you need the cooperation, but you need, projects that are shovel ready. And I think that one of the things that we're going to talk about this afternoon are the, 10 or 12 or even more, substantial shovel ready projects that are pieces of land that are in friendly hands that we think will be able to, get executed on within a reasonable period of time. The other thing that I think we have going for us in Allentown is that our real estate values are relatively low. And this is particularly, I think, important in our neighborhoods. One of the problems that Allentown has is that the housing stock in the neighborhoods surrounding the downtown is very poor. It hasn't been invested in decades. And as a result, the values are very low. And so under the Opportunity Zone legislation, we think that there are great opportunities for smaller developers and small investors to be able to go and do, renovation projects. And under the legislation, the Opportunity Zone legislation, it talks about the fact that when you make an investment, you have to basically make an investment if it's real estate, in a property that's at least equal to the basis of the property that you've acquired. So, for instance, if you buy, an apartment building for $75,000, you need to be able to make an investment at least of $75,000 or greater to be able to qualify. And those opportunities exist in Allentown. They don't exist all over, and we've studied other markets, and so that is a big deal. And so we believe that a lot of our blighted housing stock can be improved through this incentive. But I think the biggest reason that Allentown is a great place in terms of opportunity zones is the fact, as Evan said earlier, and Tom alluded to it as well, is that there's already robust development going on here. Over the last 4 years, we've been able to demonstrate that there is a market for market rate apartments. There's a market for Class A office space. And so as an investor, do you want to invest in an environment where there's actually momentum and established, good economics, or do you want to go into a marketplace where you're going to be the pioneer and there's a lot of risk? When you really drill down about what's happening here in Allentown, I mean, we could all walk around and see the buildings and so forth, but when you drill down a little bit more, you start thinking about, well, what's going to happen over the next 12 months in downtown Allentown? Well, when ADP moves in and the rest of Five City Center is occupied, there'll be 2,000 more people working at 8th and Hamilton. We have another building down the street, the PPL Plaza, which is coming out of a foreclosure process now and will likely be put back into the market and occupied within the next I don't know, 12 months, 24 months, that building will house 600, 700, 800 occupants. So when you think about whether City Center or anybody else builds another office building, there's going to be 2,500 to 3,000 more people working in downtown Allentown over the next year or so. And so when you think about what that will do in terms of demand for residential, for retail, for entertainment, I think it's huge. And I think that it creates that, really solid economic demand for continued development. So no matter how you kind of slice it, we think Allentown, is going to bubble up to the top as investors start looking at this stuff. I know that we're waiting for the regulations, and I know it's confusing, and I know that it's it was a topic yesterday morning in this conversation that I was in. A lot of people are waiting. There's a lot of question marks, but I think that once the regulations come out, the legislation is so robust, people will figure out what the structures are, what the organizational structures are, how they put their thing together. But I think that ultimately the most challenging thing with respect to this is not going to be how to raise capital. It's going to be to find places to deploy the capital. Where is an investor going to be able to get an appropriate risk-adjusted return? And I think that's when it gets to that point and there's capital formed, finding the right places to invest, I think Allentown will be very attractive. I think for us here that are local, I think that, that already know about this, I think there's a great opportunity for us to continue to, stay ahead of the curve. I know that there's a number of people in here that are already actively investing in the neighborhoods around downtown, and they've already seen a lot of appreciation in some of the investments they've made over the last couple of years. But I think that we have a really good thing right here in our backyard, and I know there's a lot of people in this audience today that aren't from the backyard as well. So we're really bullish about where we are, and we're going to continue to invest as part of this.
Don, what are you seeing?
Well, a lot, and I really want to talk about the community end of things, and I really want to do that as a way of illustrating the partnerships and collaborations that have been so important to make things happen. Evan talked earlier about having the institutional resources working together in a way as a powerful tool to make things happen. And I think that's true here in Allentown in a big way. I see it in some other communities, but not quite like I've seen it here. And I want to talk in particular about the Downtown Allentown Community Development Initiative, which is the collaboration that I coordinate. And, the success of the NIS is obvious, even if you're not from here, and I know some of you aren't, just driving in here, what you've seen, or if you take a tour with us afterwards, it doesn't take a lot of explanation. I don't think there's another city this size anywhere in the United States that's seen anywhere close to the amount of success that we've seen here revitalizing this business district. But even going back 4 years ago when the group of CEOs that I work for looked at that and looked at the bigger picture and stepped back a little bit and say, well, if the end result is a revitalized business district, is that sufficient? If it's surrounded by neighborhoods that haven't yet shared in that prosperity. And the conclusion was pretty obvious, and I give a lot of credit to sort of the founding fathers of that. JB was one of them, Bill Spence was another, John Nespoli from Sacred Heart Hospital, Scott Fainer from BBT Bank, and that's now grown into a group of 14 CEOs and the 3 foundation heads here in Allentown that are Allentown-based foundations that meet every 6 weeks and talk about what can they do to pool their resources, to coordinate their resources. Let me say a word about what DACD is not. It's not the creation of a new foundation that's going to have millions of its own dollars. It's just about effective communication between the private sector entities that really care about downtown Allentown, so the resources they have are most effectively employed. So when they looked at that situation, great success, but enclaves of poverty around it, they said, well, we have to make sure that the newfound prosperity of the business district spreads into neighborhoods. So, a couple of lessons learned that formed the tactics and the strategy that we used to try to change that. One, I'll just draw from my own experience that I worked at PPL for 20 years. Before that, I was the city's community development director for 20 years. And a lesson I learned the hard way there is that a bricks and mortar attack alone is not enough to revitalize a neighborhood. That we went through large sections of the neighborhoods we're talking about, and when we were done, there were properties that were brought up to code standards. They had new curb, new sidewalk, new street trees, new street lights, and that short term was a nice success. But it just was not a comprehensive enough effort, and that really needs to be part of the equation here. In particular, there needs to be a lot of effort put into education, because education, in and of itself is important. It can enhance the prosperity of the neighborhood residents, but it also ties directly to whether people are willing to live in those neighborhoods. And another quick tale, that one of the things we did when we first formed the group was go to some other cities that had analogous situations. And they weren't totally analogous in that it wasn't a group cooperating, it was one entity that had a lot of resources, but was surrounded by challenged neighborhoods. Like Penn and Johns Hopkins are two good examples. And I'll talk about Penn in particular, that a lesson we drew from them is they did some nice things. Both of those groups did. There was some low-hanging fruit, one of which is an employer-sponsored subsidy for their employees to buy houses in the neighborhoods. And we did that within a couple of months of our formation, and we have a Live Near Your Work program here in Allentown that a lot of the members of the DACD steering committee are willing to give a $10,000 forgivable loan to their employees if they buy and live in a house in downtown Allentown. And that's a nice little program. But by far the biggest success story that Penn had was the Penn Alexander Elementary School, where they put a lot of their dollars into completely redoing, providing a new innovative curriculum, a new school, actually physically a new school, right next to Penn. And they went from a situation like we've had here in Allentown for years, that even if people were pioneers and moved into downtown houses, rehabbed them, it happened far too often that as soon as they had school-age kids, they moved out. And they had that in West Philadelphia in a big way, but when they redid a school that turned out to be a really excellent school, people went from fleeing the neighborhood to get away from the school to buying properties in that neighborhood specifically to make their children eligible to go to that school. So one of the things that our group has come together to do was to try and partner with the Allentown School District in innovative ways. And I won't drill down into these details, but there's a couple of nice success stories there already, starting with Building 21 High School, that the business community came together, and once we had found somebody who had an idea for an innovative approach to a high school, the business community raised $3.5 million to cover the capital cost of renovating a call center building into a high school. And the school district's end of the bargain was they provided funding as they provide to the other high schools in Allentown, and that's a big success. And more recently, City Center's partnered with Community Services for Children that runs the Head Start programs here in the Valley, and started a learning hub in the Morning Call building, where there are now 6 classrooms full of Head Start children that wouldn't have been served without that partnership with the business community. So a lot of those things we still need to keep pushing on. Other things like partnering with police department to lower crime rates, other nuts and bolts things that are necessary to all come together at the same time. I want to say a few things about other partnerships. The DACD partnership isn't unique. That's a purely private sector partnership. But there's some other long-standing, really successful public-private partnerships. Upside Allentown is one of those, utilizes a state tax credit program to obtain $550,000 a year of funding that goes into the neighborhood, and that's part of the long-standing successes that Alan Jennings and Community Action Council of Lehigh Valley have been able to produce. And it's an interesting mechanism. It's business money, but the money is directed by a coalition, a steering committee of neighborhood people that I co-chair with a neighborhood resident, and there are many, many active neighborhood residents who direct that money. over a 6-year period. And I also want to say, I don't want to steal Scott Unger's thunder, but I want to say a word about AEDC as an important, again, another illustration of lining up those institutional resources. That AEDC was created in 1980, and there's hardly anything that's happened in this town in the economic development universe that they didn't have their hand in. Public-private partnership, by definition, at least 51% private sector members of the board, but they had a hand in assembling the properties that resulted in the arena block here. Many of the properties downtown here prior to the NIS were ADC projects. And now they've shifted their mission to manufacturing, and Scott will talk about that later. But I mentioned them just as another illustration of an organization that was created for longevity. It's an organization that has survived 6 mayoral transitions and continues to go strong. So I think having those kind of resources in this community really is part of the story of how people work here to get things done. And I'll close by just saying another word about Leonard Leitner and the importance of the city organization, that there's certainly always a need for a strong public sector partner, whether it's housing rehab or the regulatory things that JB talked about. But that's been very efficiently in place here, that things can get done here in a hurry.
Dawn, given your role, have you looked at the opportunity zones as a source of revenue potentially for altruistic rather than profit motive, in the sense of being able to use the investments, maybe deferring the return to do affordable housing or some form of mortgage program or something to focus on the neighborhoods and encourage the redevelopment of residents in that neighborhood?
Yeah, we absolutely have, and I'll mention a couple of quick examples. That one is we've been looking, some of the sites that people can hear about later today, as available sites, have been looked at for affordable housing projects, or actually something I'd really like to see us pull off here is a mixed income housing project, and a number of us are going to the purpose-built community conference next week and would really like to make Allentown into the next purpose-built community. And one of the foundations of their city revitalization program is mixed income housing, and an opportunity zone investment, I think, could work very, very nicely within that framework. Or even purely affordable housing, where we have a conversation going with the Housing Authority and a private sector developer looking at an AEDC-owned site that we're also thinking opportunity zones would work very nicely for. And some of the map in the back of the room, the big red parcels on there, are potential industrial parcels. And a couple of things I'd say about those. AEDC has been very adept about taking abandoned industrial buildings and reconverting them into business incubators. So it could be a real estate investment in another incubator. It could be an investment in a startup business tenant in one of those buildings. Or it could be just there's a real shortage in the marketplace in the Lehigh Valley in smaller industrial space, like 30 to 50,000 square foot space. So that could be a prime opportunity zone investment in properties that AEDC already controls and has done a lot of the heavy lifting to prepare it for investment.
That leads really into a question for you, JB. You're doing major developments in downtown, but do you see an opportunity with the opportunity zone for smaller developers? So people that are looking to maybe take one of those parcels, smaller parcels, and do the development. As this shapes up, do you see a role for that? Want-to-be entrepreneurs here in Allentown?
Yeah, I do. And I think in many ways, the smaller projects might be easier to do than the larger projects. The capital is going to be a little easier to put together, and the deal structure could be a little simpler. So kind of one piece of financing for one individual project. And as I said earlier, the fact that we have a lot of low-cost real estate around the downtown, I think creates this particular interest for small investors. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for small investors, and I hope people don't get intimidated by the legislation, because I think that once the regs are out there, I think, align yourself with the right, advisor, legal advisor, accounting, financial advisor, and I think they're actually going to be pretty easy to put together on the small scale. I think some of the bigger funds, there are more complex issues with that, but I think that there's a real sweet spot for small investments in places like Allentown.
So do you see a fund being created for Allentown specifically, or are you going to be sort of in the market, in the big pond, chasing funds from New York and Philly and other places?
City Center is considering creating its own fund, but I think that we're also going to see outside capital come into this market,
Right.
because it goes back to the point I made earlier. I think the hardest thing at the end of the day is not that there's not going to be funds raised. It's going to be where, for every $100 that have been raised, there might be $5 of good investable projects. So I think what will happen over time is that smart money will find the good projects. And so I think places like Allentown will see an influx of capital from outside.
Right.
And that came out yesterday in this conversation I had in New York City. There's no question to me that funding will find its way to places like Allentown.
Because it has its act together.
Right.
I mean,
all
that-
those attributes. Yeah.
And I traveled to a lot of cities, and cities that get it, that they need good public-private partnerships, both regulatory and maybe in sharing some financing, are the ones that I see really blossoming around the country.
Right. I mean, a developer or an investor has 8,700 choices. So why are they going to choose a place like Allentown? They're going to choose a place like Allentown if the community has their act together, and I think that's one of, you're going to see that in a few minutes with the other panelists. The ability to get, the leadership from the city and AEDC and ANISDA here all working together, I think is a strong signal to the marketplace that, hey, we want to cooperate. We want to make this as easy as we can for you.
Questions? Right here. Wait for the mic.
Thank you. My question is directed to Don Bernhard. Don, you mentioned the Building 21 and the idea of building schools that people actually want to send their children to, ergo wanting to live in those neighborhoods. I'd like to know how we can use those projects to increase the number of owner-occupied residences. It seems to me we have been and continue to be a city of renters. I'd like to see more people vested in their properties that they actually live in. Can you tell me how some of these projects might direct that?
Yeah, great question. And to me, that's one of the best indicators of a healthy city. And the home ownership rate in Center City, Allentown, has dropped to 27%, and that's not healthy by anybody's standards. I think Building 21 in and of itself is part of the story, but I think that kind of approach needs to be carried to the elementary school level. And I don't know, Thomas Parker was here, Jen Ramos, there are some school district folks here. They are building a new elementary school to replace two of the antiquated older Center City schools. So I think that's a good start, just physical structure. There's, some indication that kids learn more and prosper better in up-to-date modern school buildings, but hopefully that will be accompanied by some innovative learning approaches. And one thing I think is super important, I mentioned the Learning Hub and Head Start. Allentown has one of the 10 best Head Start programs in the United States of America. So I think part of the trick is making sure that success with young children doesn't slip away as they progress into the K-12 system. And they have some very innovative approaches, like injecting experiential learning and more STEM content into classrooms with 3- and 4-year-olds. And I think that kind of thinking needs to find its way more into the K-12 and will result in schools that people are excited about sending their kids to.
Let me take the prerogative of mentioning, in Pittsburgh, we created a deferred second mortgage program. to make houses affordable. So let's say a developer rehabs a house and it costs $100,000, and the bank is going to appraise it at 60 because of the condition of the neighborhood. We would hold, as a city, the remaining 40,000. Somebody would buy it for 60, pay a mortgage of 60. We would hold the 40, and then when they would sell it, we would split over and above the $60,000 for dollar what it was sold for. And it was, my thought is that an opportunity zone could create a pool of money to provide that kind of deferred second mortgage to exactly the point, to raise the home ownership and not sort of get on the hamster wheel of just doing a rental property. We were very focused on home ownership in that regard, and I have to say during the recession we had a very low foreclosure rate in the city, so people were able to stay in their houses. So I would suggest there are ways of connecting the opportunity zone with providing deferred second mortgage financing to help moderate income people get into home ownership. Other questions? Yes, sir. 2, 1. After you're done, pass the microphone to him.
Okay, all right, thank you. Coming from the Wall Street side, and we're talking about opportunity zone funds, either JB or Charlie or Evan, when the regulations are passed, are they going to come out as security regulated by the SEC, or who's going to rule on how those funds are treated?
Evan and Charlie are going to be back up here. We're going to have a larger panel, so unless one of you two can answer that, we'll defer that question to Evan when you come back up on the panel, okay?
This is a procedural question. There's a lot of information. I'm a strategist. I help small businesses, nonprofits, and individuals. If they want to find out about the information and they can't be here today, where's the one place that they should go first to begin the process of evaluating the information and reaching out to connect with the information and resources that they need?
Well, we have a website, the Allentown Opportunity Zone website. I think that's the place to start.
And I might ask Evan 2 questions now you have to remember to respond to that later also. Other questions? Going once, going twice. Come on. What? You got to be confused by this point. Yes, ma'am. Right over here again.
Busy in the morning. Is the assumption that money coming from the funds will be less expensive to the developer than a traditional lender, or that it would be more like mezz debt?
Well, I think that, first of all, that if you wanted to quantify the tax incentives that Evan walked through before, the deferred, the reduction, and then the elimination of longer-term gains, the thought is that probably improves the IRR, the rate of return of the investor, by about 30 to 40%. Okay, so if you want to try to quantify that. So with that in mind, theoretically, you know, a project that was maybe had marginal economics now turns into really good economics because you've goosed your IRR by 30 to 40%. Whether the developer, how the developer, you know, spreads that between the investor and the developer is a negotiated point. But I think that the big takeaway here is that this tax, the opportunity zone tax legislation, is really robust. It's very powerful, but you got to find a project that has some decent economics behind it. You know, I think you'll take a marginal project and make it a good project. If you've got a really bad project, it may not make it, you know, an acceptable project to do. So you've got to just kind of figure that out, I think.
Other questions? Back over here? Raise your hand. Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure if this is for you guys or for the others, but is there a timeline that the fund has to invest the money into the real estate? Because I know you have to get the gain in 180 days into the fund. But when does the fund actually have to put the investment into the real estate?
I'll defer to our expert, Evan, on that.
Go ahead.
That's
3 questions, Evan. We'll get it later, okay?
But I think the real urgency, though, the real urgency is that to make the investment sooner creates bigger tax benefits. In other words, you get the 15% reduction in your deferred capital gain by making the investment at the end of 2019. And again, I think that's a really important benefit that this area has to offer, that we're shovel ready, we're ready to go. And I think that is going to be a really critical thing that investors are going to be looking at. How can I get these funds deployed quickly into good projects?
And I think it's important to get on the radar quickly, too, because what I watch with developers is that they feed on each other, is that somebody comes and invests here, and then they go and say it was a great experience in Allentown, so other people will follow. And the quicker you can get on that radar, the more important it is. Other questions? Yes, over here.
So obviously we're here in Allentown. I'm just curious if, because obviously there's so many opportunity zones, will this create a sense of diversity between all the cities that might be in the neighboring area, like Bethlehem and Easton and Allentown, where everyone's now competing for the investment dollars that are coming into an area? Or will we see them try to work together to bring in outside capital?
I'll go back to what I said before. I think that there's going to be way more capital out there looking for a very small number of deals that make economic sense. So I don't think it's going to be a question, well, we're going to do this project in Allentown and we're not going to do this project in south side of Bethlehem. I think if the deal makes sense, the capital is going to be there. In Bethlehem, you've got the CRIZ overlaid, is overlaid in a big part of the opportunity zone. I know Evan has looked at CRIZ investments with his investors. So I think Bethlehem is really is teed up well. I think Easton is there's a lot of great stuff going on in Easton. They don't have a CRIZ, but there's other Easton's got a lot of positive. Easton's, in my view, a low risk place to invest because of all the positive momentum in that marketplace. I think Easton's going to get capital invested. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game.
And just two quick things for me. It's Lehigh Valley Economic Development Corporation's job to promote the entire valley, not one city competing with another, and that's what they do. They do it very effectively. And the second quick thing I'd say, there may be 8,700 of these zones, but there's a lot of low-income zones that there's just not anything going on, and it's going to take a while to create projects. So not every place is like Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton, where there are projects ready to go.
So the four speakers are going to be coming up after a 10-minute break. Plus, we're going to add three additional speakers. Leonard Leitner, Steve Bamford, and Scott Unger are also going to come up. And they'll have a couple minutes to say a few words, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So go get a cookie, get something to drink, and get back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Can I ask everybody to sit down, please, and we get started. We're going to have three additional panelists. Leonard Leitner is Director of Community and Economic Development for the City of Allentown. You need code enforcement, you need zoning, you need lots of stuff from the city. Leonard's the person to see. We have Steve Bamford. Steve is the Director of the Allentown Neighborhood Improvement Development Authority, and so he's directly involved with the neighborhoods and trying to get investment there. And we have Scott Unger, Executive Director of the Allentown Economic Development Corporation. And Scott particularly is going to talk about manufacturing opportunities in the zone. I'm going to start really quickly with a question to Steve about Goody Clancy. Recently did a study. Goody Clancy is a national planning firm, and they did a study in the opportunity zone about investments in neighborhoods, and one particular one is in the residential development up on North 7th Street. Do you want to touch on what they recommended there?
Sure, Tom. So Goody Clancy is a firm based out of Boston that is a design and urban planning firm that was engaged by the city to prepare the Allentown Downtown Development and Urban Design Plan that was authored back in 2014. So 2014 is when all this development kicked off. The arena that is attached to this hotel, PPL Center, opened in September 2014. I think this hotel followed very quickly thereafter, like January of 2015. So the development in this arena block was the catalyst for everything you see in the NIS. So that downtown plan dates back to 2014, and obviously a lot has changed over the last 4 years or so. However, the plan is still very relevant. So what we asked them to do more recently is take a look at some of these key development sites that have been identified and study them and come up with some concepts as to what they think might work in today's downtown within the context of the existing plan. So one of the sites that Tom was alluding to is one block north of here on North 7th Street, just north of Linden. It's a site that's primarily controlled by the Allentown Parking Authority. They did a very rough conceptual study and laid out a hotel development with some structured parking and a residential component, which is very important to making this live, work, play environment that we're all fostering here. I have a summary of that conceptual study they did for that site, as well as 2 others that you're all more than welcome to take a copy with you. We had them take a look at, in this case, what is primarily a hotel development. It's a mixed-use development, but primarily hotel with some residential. We also asked them to take a look at a primarily office development and then a residential development. All 3 of those conceptual studies, are available at a NISDA's table, which will be out in the lobby after we wrap
Thanks,
up
Steve.
here.
You have 3 questions you have to answer. Go ahead, Evan.
Does this work? Okay. All right. First question, I think, was SCC compliance, right? So this is mostly going to relate to if we actually do see the creation of funds in a more traditional sense. If those funds are making investments on behalf of investors who are putting their money in and then basically looking at it as any other financial product, which is ultimately the goal, we do expect that that will receive some degree of regulation and very similar to what exists today for various types of funds. Some funds, opportunity funds rather, are being set up as REITs. So a REIT, for example, that happens to be an opportunity fund will be regulated as a REIT. It will just have this additional layer of being an opportunity fund. A lot of these funds are just for projects or they're single businesses. That's almost purely regulated by the IRS alone. It's a form that you fill, a self-certification form that you fill out. It's supposed to be 1 page long. We don't know what's on it exactly, but it's going to be very, very simple. So really the compliance questions relate to just anything you would have done anyway as a new corporation, S Corp, C Corp, however you're organizing the fund, or REIT, or blind pool. There's a lot of trust questions that you can go to as well with this. So that's a short answer to question 1. Question 2, where would I look? Definitely beyond just the local. I have to say the Allentown site's one of the most impressive in terms of the resources that it has there today. DCED has some good resources. Nationally, Enterprise Community Partners and Locus, I would say separately, are the 2 strongest sort of national information you're looking for in opportunity zones. The organization that we're working together with, Accelerator for America, our kind of comprehensive paper on this will be out Monday. I'd say all those places would be good to look to. The third question is deployment of funds. So your fund has to be 90% invested in qualified opportunity zone business property. 10% can be invested in whatever you want. But the idea is to encourage you to make sure that you're consistently invested 90% in opportunity zone business, real estate, stock, whatever it is. Every 6 months, the IRS tests you and see if you're really doing that. If it's 85%, you pay a penalty on the 5% that's not invested in the opportunity fund. Realistically, if the test is every 6 months and you're building a building, you're not getting your building finished in 6 months. So one of the biggest pushes with regulation was to see if the IRS would create a kind of safe harbor where if you could demonstrate you're doing this for real, that you have a project that's going up, that you'd be held harmless for X amount of time, likely 30 months or something to that effect. So really, it's just every 6 months you have to make sure you meet that 90% test.
Thank you. Do our 3 new panelists have any comments, quick comments? let's go right to questions in the audience. Yes, lots over here. Third row. Yes, you first. We need a microphone. There's one right behind you. I'm sorry. You're next, Jack. Go ahead.
Can a property owner take advantage of the benefits of the zone with a property they already own, or do they have to buy another property?
Who wants to answer that? Here you go.
Evan may want to comment as well. There's a restriction on related party activity. So, for instance, if you have a piece of land and you wanted to contribute the land to the fund, you can't do that because the fund has to actually purchase the property. And then there's some other related party restrictions that I think we're still waiting to get some more clarity on. But it definitely creates issues for developers that are sitting on properties that they want to develop. They've got to figure out how to get around that.
Evan, do you have any further comment on it?
Some also depends about when that property was bought. If it was bought prior to December 31st, 2017, it could technically not be qualified property. That's an issue with the law unless you substantially improve it. So if you're sitting on land and you build a building on it, you can talk to your attorney to think about maybe structuring the two projects as separate and discrete, so to try to qualify the improvement versus just the land that you already owned. There are ways around it, but that is one of the principal issues with the law, is to make sure you're not hitting this related party rule.
Jack?
Hi. Any thoughts on how the opportunity zone could be used to make for sale new housing more affordable? Lower prices to potential home buyers?
So the city, Dawn, do you have a comment on that? I mean, part of your challenge, I think, with your organization is to do affordable housing, right?
Yeah, we're focused more on housing rehab, and I'll let Leonard ponder this and hand him the mic in a second. There's not a lot of parcels in Center City to do new construction, so I can't say I've given that a lot of thought, but I suppose you could apply opportunity zone to for sale.
Well, the opportunity zone catches a lot of the neighborhoods surrounding the Center City.
Yeah, correct. And some of the parcels, not any of the highlighted parcels on here, but right, there are some parcels that could be mixed income housing that could involve some subsidized parking and some purely market housing. And I think the market rate housing component of that could benefit from an opportunity fund investment injection.
Leonard, do you have any comments on it? Okay, go ahead. Over right next to you.
Any thoughts on how a nonprofit can benefit from the opportunity zone in terms of properties that it may acquire and work with developers to, ultimately benefit the nonprofit? Maybe Evan is the one for this.
Sure. I mean, this is, I think, the most interesting space. A lot of universities, like I mentioned, and hospitals are looking into this, where a nonprofit or any kind of organization might try to just set the terms by providing some degree of additional financial incentive. So if you hold that property, you can offer it to a potential investor that meets the kind of requirements that you put forward. But I think what we're seeing mostly is this concept of de-risking, where a nonprofit will come alongside an investor for maybe a more marginal property, know they're not going to get the tax benefit necessarily, but try to encourage investment and third-party investment in that space. Nationally, I think the biggest initiative of this is Rockefeller and Kresge foundations are creating a multi-billion-dollar loan guarantee pool to attempt to direct investment where they want to see it. And I think that principle holds completely true locally. And so whether it's Lehigh or Muhlenberg or Lehigh Valley Health Network, there's so many different ways that those organizations can benefit from this, either through property or, like I said earlier, by encouraging businesses that would benefit their mission for being established and qualified, and then sort of providing matching or seed investment to those related businesses.
Anybody have other comments from the panel on this? Let me just add, I think the opportunity zone, particularly because you pick up generally lower income neighborhoods, I think represent a huge potential opportunity for additional capital to make housing more affordable. So you ought to begin to look at that. Go ahead, Evan. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. And Evan, I think you kind of touched upon this. Did you mention that you need 90% invested into real estate, 10% in business? But then can you go beyond like if you were in one city here in this state and one city over there in that state from the same fund?
Yeah, and sorry, to be clear, it's just 90% of qualified opportunity zone property, which could be business stock, business interest, or real estate, and that can be anywhere. So as long as it just meets those qualifying definitions, you're fine. The 10% can be invested in anything else.
It's not just 90% real estate related things.
No, it was just that's an example of some of the funds in practice are maybe doing 90% real estate, 10% business to kind of make the money work. But yeah, just as long as it's qualified property, it can be in Allentown, it can be in Bethlehem, it can be in Puerto Rico. It's still all the same.
Question back in the back there. Yeah. Right here. Right, microphone coming.
What is considered for IP? Is IP considered in this whole thing as well?
IP is considered, as long as the IP is used for the benefit of the opportunity zone business, it's fine. If it's determined that a substantial amount of the IP is basically being used for another purpose and therefore it's just the business is serving as a tax shelter, then that's a problem. So there is a rule and regulation relative to the use of IP. But the IP itself, the value of that IP has to be reflected in the stock or the partnership interest the business that's using that IP offers. So it's effectively valued through that equity.
Scott, let me put you on the spot for a moment and talk a little bit about manufacturing. I think we're talking primarily about commercial, but there are several sites on the map that are big and have you looked at the opportunity zone as how it would apply to that?
Sure. I think there's actually a couple different facets to it. And we've talked, and one of the unique things about that Allentown is that there's so many different ways to invest, and we've talked about commercial, residential, office, and there's also manufacturing opportunities too. And something that is unique to Allentown relative to manufacturing is AEDC currently owns, operates, or manages about 440,000 square feet of manufacturing space. And what we've found, and we thought this would be really attractive for a bunch of reasons, but we were actually surprised, and this has yet nothing to do with the opportunities, and we were surprised that one of the most attractive things to our tenants is the workforce accessibility. So having manufacturing that's proximate to a workforce that can walk or take a short bus ride is really what we ended up discovering was a value add. And so the fact that we have the two sites 9 and 10 at the bottom, those represent more than 30 acres of potential redevelopment sites for manufacturing uses. And that just adds another element to, when we talked about all of the collaboration it takes to have a healthy community. Having a mixture of opportunities in terms of land use patterns is really critical as well, too. So manufacturing, really beneficial to communities for several reasons. One, compared to service sector, manufacturing typically is inbound wealth into a community. And the Lehigh Valley has a tremendous amount of manufacturing. Just in recent months, I think the last data that came out of Lehigh Valley Economic Development Corporation showed that the manufacturing sector was the largest percentage of the growth in our GDP, and our GDP hit the highest point ever in the last quarter. Service sector was still the highest amount, but manufacturing pushed the largest section of that growth. Nationally, I think manufacturing makes up about 12% of the national GDP. It makes up between 15 and 16% of the Lehigh Valley GDP. So it's obviously something that's important to have a blend of opportunities for Allentown residents, but it's also regionally important just in the overall economy.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
I think this is a question for JB and perhaps Evan. If an investor buys a property in a qualified opportunity zone and they have to put an equivalent amount of improvements into that property as the purchase basis, what's the time frame? If I buy a property for $80,000 in a qualified opportunity zone, do I have a year? Do I have 5 years, or is it the whole 10 years to invest $80,000?
30 months? 30 months.
Did everybody hear that 30 months? Okay. Other questions? Other questions? Let me ask the panel, Leonard, maybe you talk about, we've heard a lot about public-private partnerships in Allentown and how effective they are, and you're at the point of that from the public point of view. How do you see that working? So an investor, big or small, comes to the city. How do you help them get through the bureaucracy?
Well, good evening or good afternoon. I know that's a lot of concern for people when they want to work with the city, that there's going to be red tape and it's going to be difficult to get through the process. But we like to consider ourselves solution-oriented. So we do have a business development manager or business improvement manager that we like to look at a one-stop shop. If you come in, you'll meet with him or her, and at that point, we'll kind of walk you through the process. We like to start with our zoning, and we try to do it at a team approach. We won't have you sit with one person, go to another person, and go to another person. So we'll bring the team together, starting with zoning, starting with planning, and with our business development manager as well. And we'll walk you through the process. We understand that time is money, and we don't want to belabor the process. So again, just as the city is looking for this opportunity that we have right now, we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of the time that's given. With the time being limited, you get 30 months to invest that. We want to make sure we get the project through the process as fast as possible. So that's how we do it. And again, it's been mentioned several times up here before about the collaborative efforts. We always try to work with, and part of the city's role as well is to know our partners. We work hand in hand with the partners, our shareholders, our stakeholders, as well as the new investors coming in. So part of the city's role is to know what's happening, knowing where the opportunities are at, and knowing what the investors are looking for, but also know where those opportunities are at.
Thank you. Do you have a pretty clear vision of what you'd like to see happening in the opportunity zone in the various areas? And is there a place for people to get that vision or strategy?
Oh, real simple. We just want everything developed. Invest. That's what we want you to do. No, but on a serious side, we do. I mean, we've worked together with AEDC. We work together with City Center, our nonprofits, Allentown Parking Authority. So we know that there's sites that are available, and what we call, again, it's been mentioned up here several times before, properties that are in friendly hands. So if they're in the friendly hands, we can actually help, facilitate that process and work through the process as well. But the vision itself is to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. So if there's vacant land, there's vacant properties. We work with our redevelopment authority as well. So wherever there's those opportunities there, we want to try to connect you as the investor with those opportunities as quick and efficient as possible.
Thank you. Any other further questions? Going once, going twice? Okay, come on up, Gio. I want to thank our panelists. They stayed on time, and we learned a lot today, so thank you very much. I'm done. Let me just say it was a real pleasure to be in Allentown today. I'm impressed, as I always am, with what's going on here, and also impressed with the fact that 200 plus of you showed up today interested in wanting to invest in Allentown. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom, Evan, and Charles Dent for coming out of town into town. I know you've been traveling quite a bit, so thank you very much for making the time today. And just a couple housekeeping. The program is not over. You may have more questions. You didn't want to raise your hand, but you have a question for somebody up here on the panel. The panelists will be in the lobby in the foyer area. So the city, AEDC, the parking authority, ANISDA will be in the lobby at a table with information about their organization and parcels that they own that may have some investment opportunities. In addition, in the foyer, we're also going to have Luke DeLuca, who's here. Thanks for coming out. He is going to be manning a table. For some of you that don't know him, he's from Rittenhouse Realty. He's a small investor that has been here in Allentown and has multiple success stories. So if you want to talk to somebody that's done some smaller investments, Luke will be out there. You can talk to him. In addition, we have 2 law firms, Gross McGinley, Fitzpatrick Lensambuba, 2 organizations that are experts in this space, as well as our partner accounting firm, RLB. So they'll have a table out there. In addition, if you want to go on a tour, if you would like to take a tour of the Center Business District, basically all the stuff that you see happening down here, Robert, my colleague who's in the back, and his colleagues, Jack and John, are going to be conducting a tour for the first 15-ish people. Then if we find there's more folks that want that tour, we'll gather you up. But again, the key is it's going to be in the lobby. All right, everybody? Well, thank you again for coming.